So in our last lecture, we finished talking about World War I, and today we're going to look at an event that was made possible by the First World War, and that is namely the Russian Revolution. And we'll also look at the revolution as the beginning of the first communist state, the Soviet Union, and how this is one of the most important political developments of the 20th century, because it will, of course, lead to the Cold War, which impacts the second half of the 20th century. Now, last lecture, we discussed the impact of World War I as it shook empires, destroyed other ones, and definitely impacted millions of human beings. And today we'll look at one of those empires that didn't survive the war, and that is Russia. Now, the Russian people had been very unhappy with the Tsar Nicholas II, long before World War I happened. Tsar Nicholas was, by all accounts, a pretty nice guy, but a very poor leader. He had been a reluctant ruler, but he was the oldest son, and there was really at this point in history no way of getting out of becoming the next Tsar. He also was very inflexible. He tended to choose bad advisors. He had been tutored growing up by men who preached that the Tsar, the monarchy, was infallible, that it was absolute. And one of the problems with the Russian monarchy at this point was that by the 20th century, most monarchies in the world, honestly, most, not all, but many, were some sort of constitutional monarchy like the British system. Now, that's not quite the case in Germany, but a lot more monarchies were taking on more and more democratic tones, kind of responding to the desires of the people. But Russia wasn't really hip with the times, if you will. And Nicholas was not really, honestly, he probably wasn't the right ruler for this particular moment in Russian history. As I said, he did not relish becoming Tsar. In fact, when his father died, a lot younger than anyone expected, and Tsar Nicholas was both overcome with grief at the death of his father, but he was also terrified of becoming Tsar himself. Many historians have argued that, had he been the second or the third son, he probably would have been a way happier person. And honestly, it's hard to know how very different Russian history would be if that were the case. Now, in the lead up to World War I, Tsar Nicholas made some pretty bad decisions. In 1905, there was a revolution wherein workers were asking for more rights because Russia had started to industrialize, as you learned about in week 1, and the workers were wanting safer working conditions and things like that. Nicholas promised that he would do those things, and then he went back on all those promises, which only angered the Russian people even more. In 1905, the Russians lose a war against the Japanese. This looks very bad for Tsar Nicholas. And why this is so bad for him, these things, is because in an absolute monarchy, that king or queen or czar or whatever you want to call them, they're the top dog. The buck stops with them. Yes, they have advisors, but many of them do not have parliaments. They don't have any other governing body that can check their power. And so historically, when you have an absolute ruler, things are fine if that ruler does a good job. Things generally go bad when that ruler does a bad job. And that's exactly what's going to happen here in Russia with Tsar Nicholas. Now, World War I is particularly tough on the Russians. As I've kind of mentioned before, Russia industrialized later than a lot of other European nations. Even by 1914, they were not close to the industrial production of Western Europe, Japan, or even the United States. And this meant that their weaponry was woefully inferior to what the Germans had. And on the Eastern Front, it's going to be the Russians versus the Germans. The Germans in 1914 had the best army as well as the best weapons in the world. Now, one small example of this is while most armies learned very quickly during the war that wearing colorful uniforms was a really bad idea because it made you a very clear target for the enemy snipers, and they had also learned that metal helmets were the best chance of protecting soldiers from gunfire, The Russian army never got that memo. They are the only army that continue to wear cloth hats for the entire war. That's not because necessarily that they're stupid or something. It's because they actually don't have the industrial capacity to produce millions of metal helmets. Oftentimes, Russian soldiers went into battle without proper shoes, and sometimes would be sent in behind another soldier without a gun. And the idea was, well, you go behind that guy with the gun, and when he dies, you pick up his rifle, and then you carry forward. I mean, imagine that. Imagine going over the top into no man's land, no gun, no shoes, and a cloth hat. That's a pretty tough position for the Russian soldiers to be in. Just as in Germany, Russia ended up suffering severely on the home front. Starvation, the heavy death toll at the front were becoming increasingly harder for the Russian people to bear. By 1917, the Russians had lost 9 million total casualties. That's 2 million dead, 5 million wounded, 2.5 million prisoners of war or missing. 9 million casualties, that's absolutely staggering. Absolutely staggering. Now, this leads to what I like to call my historian's math equation. You have decreased legitimacy for the Tsar. No one has faith in Nicholas. Add to that the horrible experience of World War I, plus starvation on the home front, just like we had in Germany. It equals an atmosphere absolutely ripe for revolution. And that's exactly what we're going to get. Now, when we talk about the Russian Revolution, a lot of times people think it was just one, but there were actually 2 revolutions that same year, and the first happened in February. You'll also see this referred to as the March Revolution. The reason for that discrepancy is at the time, Russia was on a different calendar than the rest of the world. So it depends on if you're looking at a source from a Russian perspective or a European or American perspective. Now, the February Revolution of 1917 started out as a bread riot that picked up momentum and turned into a spontaneous revolution. What happened was, there's so little food. What happened was people would have to go wait in those ration lines for hours upon hours, hoping when they got to the front that there would actually be food left to give them. And what happened in February is a group of women worked all day in the factory, 14-hour day, whatever it was, went to wait in line to get bread, got to the front, there's no food. And these women have had it. This means there's no food to feed their families. They're already starving. And they get mad. They get good and mad. And they begin to walk towards the palace where the Tsar is. And as they're walking, they sort of gather up more people who are also mad. So again, it's very spontaneous. It's not an we're going to launch a revolution sort of thing. Very, very spontaneous. But it forces the Tsar to abdicate, to give up his throne. Now, he does think about giving the throne to his son, Alexei, who is about 10 or 11 at the time. But Alexei has hemophilia, which is a disease which means your blood doesn't clot. So say normally if, let's say, you fell down, banged your shin into something, your blood would clot, right? Preventing you from bleeding out. That's why we have bruises. With hemophilia, that doesn't happen. So your blood doesn't clot, so you could potentially bleed out internally from something as simple as falling down. Now, this was very secret. The Russian people did not know that the heir to the throne, Alexei, had hemophilia. And that's the main reason why Nicholas doesn't want to do this to his son. His son is so young. He has this debilitating disease. Nicholas does not want to put his son in this position. So he abdicates. And into that comes the provisional government, a democratic government. So very similar to what's going to happen in Germany the following year, revolution followed by democracy. Now, this democratic government is led by a guy named Alexander Kerensky, who is a very well-known Russian lawyer. He was in his 30s, so pretty young to be in charge of a country. And they have to decide what they're going to do about the war. They know the war is unpopular, but they decide to stay in. And the reason why is Kerensky and the government felt like they had made a commitment to Britain and France, the other allies. And they knew that if Russia left the war, then Germany could turn its whole army from the Eastern Front to the West and on to the British and the French. And this is early 1917. That's after Verdun and the bloodletting of 1916. So it's very understandable why the British and the French would have been very concerned about Russia potentially leaving the war. So they stay in for very logical reasons. But unfortunately for them, staying in World War I is going to cause them to lose legitimacy and is actually going to lead to the Second Russian Revolution. Now, the group of people who will lead the Second Revolution are known as the Bolsheviks. Now, the Bolsheviks were led by this guy, Vladimir Lenin. Now, Lenin, at this point, when revolution breaks out in early 1917, Lenin is actually in Germany, and he'd been there for 10 years. He had been exiled by the Russian government because he was really loud and annoying about wanting a change of government, and he specifically was really into Karl Marx, who we talked about in week 1. And he said, he really loved Marx's ideas about, using violence to create an egalitarian state for the worker. He really loved all those ideas. But he said, the one real problem here is that Marx said that the revolution could only happen after the working class, the proletariat, had been pushed down by the bourgeoisie for a long time due to industrialization. The problem for Russia is that they were really far behind on industrialization. Some major cities were industrialized, but certainly not all of Russia, and certainly not on the level of Britain or Germany. So Lenin says, okay, then we're going to have to adapt Marx's ideas to fit Russia's needs. So the way that the Bolsheviks will proceed is going to be not how we saw it happening under Marx. Basically, I always say this is Lenin takes Marx's ideas and kind of perverts them into something that will work for him and him personally. And I mean that quite truly. Now, the Bolsheviks will launch their revolution later in 1917. Lenin gets back for this one. The Germans know he's living in Germany. They put him on a train and they basically go, let's send this really outspoken Russian guy back to Russia and see what kind of trouble he could get up to. Little did the Germans know he was about to completely and utterly change history. So Lenin is back. He and the Bolsheviks begin campaigning on the message of bread, peace, and land. Very simple message, but it spoke to the hearts of a lot of Russians. Bread, everybody's starving, right? So the promise of food is a big deal. Peace, getting out of the war, and land. At this point, most Russians were peasants who rented land from large landowners to farm. Most people did not own anything, home, land, anything. And so bread, peace, and land was a very convincing, very attractive argument. And through it, the Bolsheviks are able to take control in late 1917. Now, this revolution was staged by a relatively small group. Even though the Russian people were worn out and they liked this message of bread, land, and peace, they weren't necessarily totally on board yet with the Bolsheviks. Now, once the Bolsheviks take over, we'll see how they handle the question of the war. But one thing I want to remind us of, and this goes back to our lectures last week, is the difference between these various ideologies. Remember that socialism is the idea that the ownership of property, businesses, and the government should be in the hands of the community, but that this could be achieved non-violently, and it could be achieved by working within the system, that you didn't need to have a revolution, that you could enact better social change through democracies, etc. Marxism, remember that is Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who argued that capitalism was the problem, that capitalism, that desire for more profit, exploited the workers, that the workers will eventually rise up and create a classless society through revolution. Remember, Marx believed it needed to be violent, where everything was in the hands of the community. Now remember, Marxists and the communists in the late 19th century had a lot of the same ideas. But if you remember back to last week, I also sort of gave you some foreshadowing that communism, when it was put into practice in the 20th century, looked very different from how people thought it would in the 19th century. Communism in the Soviet state, and then later in China and Cuba and Vietnam and North Korea, will come to mean that the control of property, businesses, and the government are in the hands of a totalitarian state that is governed by one self-perpetuating political party. That is not what was intended, and that's why I spent a lot of time on this last week, is because, as I said, Lenin takes these other ideologies and kind of ends up perverting them for his own gain and his own power. It's that thing of, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's exactly what happens here. Lenin and his successors, Stalin, Khrushchev, etc., will all really like being in charge and really like having total control, and they're not going to give that up. And that's one of the problems with the Bolshevik Revolution, is that a lot of people are in this for more of the Marxist and the socialist ideology of creating an egalitarian and equal society where everybody has an equal shot at happiness, etc. And a lot of them are going to feel very betrayed by Lenin and Stalin in the 1920s and 30s, because that is definitely not what happens. Now, some of the immediate impacts of the revolution. The first thing is the Bolsheviks get out of World War I. To them, World War I is a capitalist war for empire, all the things they hate, and they're not totally wrong about that. And they decide they're going to get out. And they sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans in March of 1918. This is a huge treaty. It basically was Russia giving up the Baltic states, so that's Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They also gave up a chunk of Polish territory and all of the Ukraine. That's huge. I mean, the Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe at the time, so Russia was giving up quite a bit. In total, this area was 3 times the size of Germany. So Germany triples in size with this one treaty. They gain 62 million people, 1 million square miles. Absolutely staggering. Basically, Lenin gave up most of the territory that had been won by Russia since the time of Peter the Great. Now, these conditions were considered so humiliating by many in the Russian army, so much so that one Russian general went out and shot himself immediately after signing. Now, you might be wondering, why in the world would Russia give up so much? Well, they give up so much because Lenin is playing the long game. Lenin and the Bolsheviks believe that this is only the beginning, and that their revolution will inspire further revolutions, which in the end will mean everybody will be communists like them, and that basically that means he'll get all this territory back. So Lenin is, as I said, playing the long game. And the crazy thing, he's not wrong. He is really not wrong. After World War II, Russia gets all of that stuff back. Now, Lenin won't live to see it, but again, he is kind of playing the long game here. Long-term impacts of the Russian Revolution. This revolution created the first communist state in human history. This has, as I said at the top of the lecture, huge ramifications for the 20th century. From this point onward, the Soviet Union and the United States will be on a collision course towards each other. Now, this won't really heat up until World War II. We will talk about that before the class is over, but that's kind of the direction we're going in. Without World War I, the Russian Revolution would not have happened. Now, historians, we like to steer away from what-if questions because what-if questions are really impossible to answer. But it is safe to say that World War I made the conditions very ripe for the Russian Revolution to happen when it did and how it did. So once again, why World War I is so incredibly important to understand. Now, what happens after that? They get out of World War I. What's next? The Bolsheviks and Lenin believed that the revolution, and that's a revolution with a capital R, is the highest good. And that anything you do to protect it, that means protecting the communist states, anything along those lines, anything you do to protect it is considered okay. This is a very ends justify the means mentality. It's actually very Machiavellian, that whatever you have to do to preserve the Soviet state is acceptable. And that idea is going to really permeate the entire existence of the Soviet Union all the way up until it falls in 1991. At this point, there are still people who supported the Tsar. There are still people who supported the provisional government. And once the Bolsheviks realized that nobody else was going to have a revolution like they did, once they realized that, they had to turn from exporting the revolution to protecting the revolution within the Soviet Union. And they will use this to justify all manner of cruel behavior, murder, assassination, you name it. As long as it's being done to protect the state, it is acceptable. Now, one of the reasons why the Soviet Union is very afraid is because they believe that they are at risk for an invasion from the West. Once World War I is over in 1918, the Soviets get very concerned that Britain, France, the United States don't like their form of government, which is true, but they're afraid that the West is going to try to invade them. And so they begin consolidating power at home to make themselves stronger should they be invaded by the West. And this will ultimately lead to the Russian Civil War. There are a lot of people in Russia who, as I said, have very different ideas about what the future of Russia should look like. Now, the Russian Civil War is fought between the Reds, who are the communists, led by the Bolsheviks, Lenin in particular, and on the other side we have the Whites, which is a combination of people who support the Tsar, liberals, that would have been people who supported the democratic government, Mensheviks, who were a socialist group, kind of like the Bolsheviks, but wanted to actually bring about an equal society, as well as foreign troops sent by the United States and Britain and various other European countries. Now, they did send, as I said, Europe, the United States sent some soldiers to help, but because this was right after World War I, they didn't have the ability to send their full armies. As we talked about in the last lecture, World War I was so unpopular by the end that there's no way that Britain or the United States could have sent their whole armies in. It just would not have been popular, would have been incredibly damaging. Now, the Civil War was extremely brutal, and this was a brutality that was made possible and almost acceptable by the brutality of World War I. And it's during the Civil War that the Bolsheviks resorted to a full-on dictatorship with Lenin in charge. Again, the revolution is the ultimate good, so in this case it justifies jettisoning all of Marx's ideas and putting a dictatorship in place. Now, we're not going to talk about all the details of the Civil War. Suffice it to say, like any civil war, it was incredibly bloody. And it lasted 3 years. It resulted in a further 1 million dead and 6 million wounded. So when you add that to the World War I dead, you have 3 million dead, 11 million wounded. This is a lot of death and destruction for Russia. And as we will see, it doesn't get any better. Even the quote-unquote peaceful interwar period is very deadly for the Russian people. World War II will be very hard, as we'll see. Russia endures about 50 years of constant death and destruction. Now, out of this, the Bolsheviks emerge on top. They win. They kill as many of the members of the Whites as they can. And after this, they declare that no other political parties are legal. Now the Bolshevik Party is just called the party. There's only one political party, it's an option now. And this solidifies them as the first communist state in history. And it's through them that they will go on to assist other communist states like China, Vietnam, Cuba, etc. So after the Civil War, the Soviet Union has, they've got kind of a tough road ahead. They've just come through, between World War I and the Civil War, a lot of years of warfare and destruction. So what now? Well, Soviet leadership promised freedom and prosperity, but unfortunately both of those promises are never going to become a reality. Now, it is important for me to reiterate that Marx never envisioned any kind of dictator in charge. So that's why historians refer to the policies in the Soviet Union as Leninism, because it's very individual to this situation. Now, ideally, this new state would have been one ran by the proletariat. There would have been no one person in charge. But Lenin believed that the proletariat were not smart enough to do this for themselves. Very condescending viewpoint. So, gracious as he was, he believed that he was the only person fit to lead them, arguing that, I'm the only one who knows the revolution, so therefore I'm the only one who can be in control. Again, this is a very condescending, paternalistic viewpoint that only he knew the best route for the state. Now keep in mind, he hadn't even lived in his home country for 10 years by the time he came back. Once at the head of the government, there was no way that Lenin was going to relinquish control. And this set a pattern for every leader of the Soviet Union after him. And you see this in other communist states like China and Cuba as well. So the socialist dream breaks down very quickly and very unfortunately for the people who really believed in it. Now, the changeover between Lenin and Joseph Stalin will happen. Lenin has a debilitating stroke in May of 1922, and that severely weakened Soviet leadership. That's only 1 year after the end of the Civil War, and the sort of state of the Soviet Union really hung in the balance. At this point, he's still the nominal leader, but he can no longer make public appearances because he did not want to seem weak. 2 years later, in 1924, he dies without appointing a successor. Now here we have one of the biggest problems with a totalitarian state like this. There's no clear way of determining a successor. Unlike a monarchy, this isn't necessarily about children. Unlike a democracy, there are no elections. So this is very problematic. When a leader dies like this, it leaves a vacuum, which is usually filled through assassinations, manipulation, threats, etc. Lenin was seen as the father of the Soviet Union, the one who had given birth to this new nation. And while we know that's not exactly how it played out, the Soviets would play that card for decades. Lenin, after he died, came to achieve an almost mythical status and became, especially for later leaders, the key to assuming and maintaining power. And you see posters like this one pictured here all the time. Lenin kind of larger than life, the father of the state. Now, after he dies, a bitter power struggle emerges between Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. Stalin's on the left, Trotsky's on the right. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, Stalin is the one who wins. But how does this happen? I love this picture of Stalin young because it's so fascinating to see him at the age of 23, before he is Stalin as we know him today. Now, Stalin is actually not ethnically Russian. He's from Georgia. And he apparently was made fun of a lot for speaking Russian with a Georgian accent, which later in his life meant that a lot of people were executed because of this. Now, Stalin initially wanted to be a priest, a Russian Orthodox priest, but he was deemed to be not smart enough nor devout enough to become a priest. So this is one of those things I always like to joke that imagine how different history would be if Stalin had become a priest. It's kind of like, imagine how differently history would be if Hitler had been allowed into the Arts Institute in Vienna and become an artist. It's kind of crazy to think about. But Stalin does not become a priest. He becomes very influenced by Marx's ideas, joins the Bolshevik Party, and becomes a very effective mid-level bureaucrat. Now, Stalin is not really known for being super intellectual, but he was very gifted at manipulation as well as blackmailing. And it's through those skills that he's able to rise through the Bolshevik Party. He plays people off of each other. He also is very, very good at finding dirt on people to eliminate them from being a challenge to him. One of his jobs prior to succeeding Lenin was he was in charge of placing people within the party infrastructure. And that meant he had access to party member files. He knew all their secrets, which made his, blackmailing much easier. Now, after Lenin's death, he chose a tactic of divide and conquer in order to defeat Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was much more left on the political spectrum than even Stalin was. Trotsky believed in more of those socialist ideas of equality and things like that. Stalin did not. I would argue that Stalin was really in this for the power of it all in many ways. He befriends a guy named Nikolai Bukharin, who's pictured next to him there, as a way to help him gain power over Trotsky. Now, I point out Bukharin because he's going to be very evident for something that happens a lot to people who are friends with Stalin. You could be friends with Stalin one minute and dead the next. And unfortunately, that's what's going to happen to Nikolai Bukharin. Stalin and Bukharin were able to push a lot of Trotsky's allies outside of Moscow, thus lessening their political power and alienating Trotsky from his supporters. Stalin also accused Trotsky of being a traitor to the revolution, which was a huge accusation, and a traitor to Lenin. Now, this demonstrates how political the revolution had become. If you could be painted in any light that showed that you would not support the revolution or Lenin, then you were a traitor, and there didn't have to be proof. This isn't about proof at all. In 1929, Trotsky was exiled to Mexico. He was later hunted down by the KGB and assassinated in Mexico in 1940. And this has actually become pretty infamous because he was actually killed by an ice pick being put into his brain, which is incredibly brutal. Now, with Trotsky out of the country, Stalin is able to portray himself as Lenin's heir. And you can see that in these propaganda posters. The one on the bottom, it's Marx, Engels, Lenin to Stalin, as though there's some kind of straight line, which definitely didn't exist. The top picture, he portrays, right, Lenin's kind of watching over him from behind him. At the party meeting in 1927, it was declared that any deviation from Stalinist ideas was condemned, which means in a short period of time, Stalin had condensed his power out of fear, intimidation, and murder. Now, at that point, he still had his old ally Bukharin. At this point, Stalin was worried about losing out to Bukharin, and he had Bukharin executed in 1938. Now, Stalin will create something known as the cult of personality. And that is, and we'll see this again with Hitler and Mussolini, that is where they're very much portrayed as these heroic, sort of more than human people who are leading the nation nobly through a lot of sacrifice. They kind of come to be portrayed as everything good. There's a lot of propaganda to really uphold that idea. Now, what's really interesting about all of this is that Lenin did not like Stalin at all. And in fact, near the end of his life, Lenin told people, do not let Stalin become the next leader. He didn't believe that Stalin could be trusted. He was very, very concerned about Stalin as the next leader of the Soviet Union. But after Lenin died, Stalin killed all those people. He tried to stifle these ideas, but luckily for us as historians, some of these people made it out and were able to show evidence that no, in fact, Lenin had not wanted Stalin as his chosen successor. Now, if that's the case, why would Stalin spend so much time showing himself as the, Lenin looking over him? Well, Lenin was, again, he had achieved mythical proportions by this point. That Stalin had to connect himself to Lenin in order to have some kind of legitimacy as the next leader of the Soviet Union. All right, that will do it for our second lecture. We will definitely talk about interwar Soviet Union